Okay, let's do it. G'day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me on another weekly tutorial as I take you through the Bible story in chronological fashion, more or less. We're reading the Bible in a year, week after week, and this is tutorial number 30, or week number 34 of our readings. My job here is to not give you devotional sort of reflections as we read, or even theological reflections. My main task in these tutorials is to help you step back and understand the big picture narrative of the Bible story as it unfolds, all right? So the period of time we're in at the moment is basically a really, really depressing time. In fact, this week we're going to be reading Lamentations, all right, and Habakkuk, which is all about lamenting the disaster that is coming against God's people at this period of history. And essentially, it's a period that lasts for 400 years from the death of Solomon through to the deportation in Babylon, all right? After Solomon died, the kingdoms divided. The northern kingdom was destroyed and divorced, okay? Covenantally dead to God as they were taken out by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom are now being destroyed and deported off to Babylon. So this 400-year period is division, death, divorce, destruction, doom and gloom, and deportation off to Babylon, all right? It's a really bad and depressing period of time. But you know what? No surprise. We knew this was coming because good old Moses told us centuries earlier that if God's people would disobey his covenant, these very things would happen to them. And the prophets come, and no matter how many times they reminded God's people, and I'm sure you've been frustrated as you've read the story, just watching God's people repeat the same sinful lessons as they defy God's covenant. So this destruction is coming upon them as their covenant has promised, all right? Well, right now we're up to the point in the narrative where Jerusalem has been destroyed. We read about that last week, and King Nebuchadnezzar basically is in charge of that. Before we look at the end of Jeremiah, which we're finishing off Jeremiah this week, I do want to highlight, though, the various campaigns that Nebuchadnezzar has brought against Jerusalem, all right? Because it's not, I just want to make it clear for you, because it's important as we understand the big picture and we see some other prophetic voices coming in the future. So here's what I've learnt, all right? The last three kings in Judah, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, each of them had Nebuchadnezzar invade and deport people during their reigns, all right? So the very first time, Jehoiakim, when Nebuchadnezzar, in the first year of him being a king, he was very ambitious, all right? He comes to Judah and he takes some people with him. Now, the narrative's not very clear on that. We only really find that out because in that deportation was a guy called Daniel, okay? That's why it's important. Daniel is taken away to Babylon way there in about 605 BC, and he's taken off into Babylon. The second conquest came in the period of the next king, about 8 years later, Jehoiachin, okay? And when that invasion took place, that's when Nebuchadnezzar himself came to the city of Jerusalem. He ransacked the temple and he took that king, Jehoiachin, away with him to Babylon. That's also important to know because within that exile or deportation was a guy called Ezekiel, which we'll find out about later. Okay, so we've got Daniel and we've got Ezekiel, and the third invasion into Judah was basically the final one, all right, the one we're reading about at the moment, when Jeremiah is right there in the thick of it in 586, 587 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar makes a final destruction of Jerusalem, burns the city and the temple and everything to the ground, and takes a whole another bunch of exiles along with him. All right, so 3 deportations in the last 3 kings of Judah, and those 3 key prophets are all involved. Daniel, who's in Babylon, we'll get to him later. Ezekiel in Babylon, we'll get to him very soon. And Jeremiah, who's watching it all happen during the last deportation. All right, so I hope that helps bring some clarity as we look forward into the future. Okay, we are finishing off the book of Jeremiah this week. It is essentially the last 12 chapters. A whole bunch of it is narrative. What we're going to find out is that when Jerusalem falls, Jeremiah is given the choice as to whether he wants to go off into Babylon or stay in his homeland, Benjamin. He decides to stay with a group of a peasant group, basically a remnant, and that group of people, while they begin in Benjamin, they actually end up going down to Egypt, even though Jeremiah warns them not to. You read about that this week. Never mind, you'll see all that happen. The other thing we read in Jeremiah is about 7 chapters, another collection of prophecies against all the surrounding nations. Now again, just like we saw last week, the narrative basically, when these prophecies are included, goes back in time. These are prophecies that he spoke at different points in history, and they're put here into a collection of 7 chapters. He prophesies against Moab and Ammon and Aram and the Philistines and Edom, and then eventually it climaxes in him prophesying against Babylon, all right? When 2 whole chapters of saying, listen, while God is using you at the moment, he's not going to let you go unpunished for this. There will come a time when he will take vengeance on you. Now, this is no surprise to us. Remember, Isaiah prophesied the exact same thing would happen at some time in the future. And what Isaiah did was he said that a guy called Cyrus of Persia would be the one to destroy Babylon. Well, Jeremiah says that what will happen is it will be a collection, basically an allied group of nations that will come together to take out Babylon, including the people called the Medes. So we have these hints 100 years before it happens, all right? We have these hints of the Medes and the Persians uniting together to take out Babylon at some point in the future. Stay tuned for that, all right? But in the meantime, Babylon are conquering and they're doing all that they can. But one day God says, your day will come. And basically the last chapter of Jeremiah is a bit of a postscript. It's not Jeremiah writing, it's added by the editor at the end. And it's basically a big copy and paste of 2 Kings, just wrapping up a bit of the history there. All right, so congratulations, that's it. You've finished Jeremiah this week. We're also reading this week the short books of Habakkuk and Lamentations, and while you can read them in one sitting, it's probably good to read them together, all right? They are both books of lament, okay? They're basically funeral songs, all right, lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. Habakkuk, we don't know much about him except the fact that he has this book, and unlike other prophets, he doesn't prophesy against Jerusalem, or he doesn't speak to any group of people. Habakkuk is basically a personal lament of himself to God, and God speaking back to him. So you'll enjoy that. It's only 3 chapters, do it in one sitting. Then we've got the Book of Lamentations, which is either written by Jeremiah or at least significantly influenced by him. And that's 5 chapters, all right? The first 4 chapters are 4 acrostic poems. Now, remember we talked about acrostic poems in the Psalms. It's basically where every stanza of the poem begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So A, B, C, D, or whatever the Hebrew equivalent is, all right? 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, 22 stanzas, and each of those 4 chapters, those 4 poems are like that. They're each different, but they are each in some way lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. And the Book of Lamentations actually became used over history with the Jewish people to recognize and to remember the destruction of Jerusalem. Incidentally, Jerusalem being destroyed now by Nebuchadnezzar, this very same thing happens again in the 1st century with Rome. And both instances happen in about the same month, about July or August. So the Book of Lamentations historically has been used every July, August. It's a history called, let me read, I've got it written down here, Tish B'Av. Okay, it's a special festival where Jewish people lament and mourn the destruction of Jerusalem those 2 times. So Lamentations is not a book of someone who's just angry and having it out with God. No, it's a very systematic book written and designed for God's people to mourn and to grieve together over the loss of Jerusalem. So what you're reading this week is basically a lot of depressing stuff. As I said at the start, it's pretty depressing, but there's always, remember, hints of hope. And even in Lamentations, a whole book devoted to mourning and grieving. Let me get emotional for a second. Let me get devotional for a second. Grieving is a really important part of the human process, all right? But even within that grief, there is a hope and calling out to God to show mercy and to restore as he has promised. All right, Habakkuk, Lamentations, and Jeremiah, you're finishing off this week. So, of all the depressing stuff you're reading, it's going to be a feel-good week. You're going to feel like you've accomplished something this week as you finish them off. Bless you guys. Enjoy the readings, and I'll see you next week as we head into Ezekiel, who we don't really know yet. I've just given you a sneak preview, but all this time, he's been, not all this time, but since the second captivity, he's been in Babylon, and God has been speaking to him in Babylon. At the same time, God's been speaking to Jeremiah, and it's amazing the way we're going to see those prophetic words correlate, even though those two didn't know one another. All right, bless you guys, and we'll see you next week. Okay, bye.